Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Octopath Traveler of Extreme Metal Podcast. I am the death metal guy, aka, it's really just like classical music if you listen.
Haven't you used that one before?
I've used variations, but there's always a new generation that pulls that.
And I'm the black metal guy, aka Ahegao Death Mask.
Look, every kid who listens to us who's in high school, I hope that there aren't any, but there's probably a couple, they know that guy. Because we all know that guy in high school,
Yeah, the insufferable long hair.
Yeah, the insufferable long hair. He's probably except, he's not saying, oh, it's like classical music and pointing to skepticism. He's pointing to, the solo on Tornado of Souls or some shit. It's,
right.
It's terrible.
Dragon Force.
Yeah. It shit sucks, dude.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
I guess not a ton to report. I should plug, I was on the Bunsen Burner podcast this past week. I think the episode just came out this week. It was nice, as always, to join up with the Bun Bun Boys. We had a nice little chat about a pretty interesting record that I wasn't really familiar with before, by Anima Damnata. Their first record. They're a Polish band that is described as brutal death meets black metal, and it sounds kind of like war metal, but it's really just sort of an extreme death metal album at heart. It's really cool, and we have a lot of good conversations on that one about what thrash is actually viable, the sort of drifting interpretation of genre boundaries, and as always, some reminiscing over MySpace deathcore from the mid 2000s. So that was a lot of fun. So we got an episode of stuff very far from all those things. So real quick, Facebook, which isn't going to really matter soon since we're going to be jettisoning it in favor of going purely to the Instagram for our promotional needs. Sorry, guys. Facebook has been dead for years, and we're just finally putting it in the ground. But you can follow...
With Facebook, you should make an Instagram burner just to follow us so that you don't lose the parasocial relationship that has become integral to your life.
Exactly. I have an Instagram burner just to follow us.
He does.
So, yeah, you can follow... so you can follow the waning days of the Terminus Facebook at Terminus Podcast. You can follow us at our primetime location at Terminus Extreme Metal. Or you can get particularly dedicated and subscribe to us on Patreon, where $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, where conversation for this week has pretty much all been about the new Marilyn Manson record.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
Ladies and gentlemen, for our first review of the evening, we have a returning feature here on Terminus Podcast. This is the newest record by Blackdeath, titled Mortui Incedere Possunt. My Latin pronunciation is not very sophisticated. That's the best I can do. Released on...
It means dead can march.
Oh, okay. That's pretty neat. This appears to be like a cooperative release between End All Life Productions and NoEvDia, but I'm not exactly sure how that works. It's listed as End All Life on Metal Archives for the CD and the vinyl, but then it's on the NoEvDia YouTube, so I'm not really sure.
I think End All Life is distributed by NoEvDia.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, yes. Cool. Blackdeath is, for those who aren't familiar, a Russian black metal band with a pretty long history going back to the late 90s. And a few years ago, we covered their second-to-last record, also Sprach das Chaos, which both of us really enjoyed. It didn't end up on our year-end list just because it's a wild and unwieldy record, about 35 minutes long, composed of 2 tracks. Very cool, but certainly not frequent listening, just because of like how it's set up. But Blackdeath is a very cool band, so we were happy to cover the newest record that just came out a couple weeks back. Blackdeath is a very challenging band to talk about, and I've got some sort of heady thoughts about them that I'll just sort of ramble off at the beginning here. Blackdeath are, as I said, a pretty long-running band, and I think this is their right around their 10th full-length record. They are a band that does not seem to be particularly concerned with like a definitive statement. They have a unique style that would be hard to mistake for anybody else, but they're very playful from album to album, playing around with, you know, stuff as simple as just sort of like the length of format, you know, specific emphases in the sound. Every record tends to sound pretty different, but none of them seem to be placed on a pedestal as like the most representative of the band. This seems to be a band that's much more interested in experimentation and exploring all the corners of their personal musical interests. This means that you kind of never know what you're going to get from a Blackdeath record, apart from the fact that it's almost always going to be very good. In this case, I think it's safe to say that it's more than very good. It's probably one of their best, and this is almost certainly one of the best black metal records of the year. We're in agreement on that, right?
Oh, yeah. This is definitely a contender for the year-end list. I mean, well, it's going to be on the year-end list. The question is how high, right? It's really good, and I agree. This is this still has all the characteristic difficulty of Blackdeath, but it is far more listenable than the last one, is, instead of just rewarding careful listening over time, right? It's sort of it's viscerally rewarding in a way that ticks, classic black metal kicks, while also being quite cerebral.
Yeah, and it's, describing Blackdeath as difficult is accurate, but it might bring to mind something incorrect for people who haven't heard the band before. This is not like excessively skronky or overwhelmingly dissonant or even atonal music. In fact, what I think is the most interesting thing about Blackdeath, especially on this album, is that if you took like any 30-second chunk of a song and just listened to that, it would kind of seem like business as usual black metal. The weirdness is found in the interrelation of the different parts, the strange, elaborate structural decisions that are made, the sort of challenging, almost polyphonic style of guitar writing that dominates this record in particular, and to a lesser extent, the band's whole discography. It feels very natural, as though it's like adhering to its own internal logic, but the experience of like listening to these songs end to end is super alien and disorienting. This is work done by guys who are extremely well practiced and skilled musicians, who are using those powers for evil. This is not like brain melting in the way of, say, the Ad Nauseam record from a couple years ago, but it's, I would compare it to something almost maybe like late Abigor, the strange otherworldliness of it.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I think we mentioned this on the last review, but one of the main guys in Blackdeath is Colonel Parabellum is a long-running zine writer and contributor to Metal Archives, and this is a guy who I think you could fairly say his style of we were influenced by a number of people, but his style of reviews certainly was formative for both of us back in the day. And if you want to see the kind of text-based metal writing from the early 2000s that inspired us, just read all his shit on Metal Archives. And he, in fact, did just release pretty recently, he reviewed the last Avigor record.
Oh, that's cool. I'll have to read that.
I guess about a year ago, but he released a very detailed review of the last Avigor record. So I think that's definitely an inspiration for them, and probably just friends of theirs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's this is a guy, and I would say probably guys in general in this band who think very deeply about this music, but also approach it with a very immediate sense of musicality and playfulness. I think that when you get really into the critical side of this stuff, it can be difficult to arrive at the songwriting as naturally as these guys do. But, these guys really kind of cover all the bases, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think in the past our line on it was not like that stupid, overrated Orthodox black metal, the same similar idea executed much better. And that's kind of true, but what I've figured sort of from this record and the press release around it, right, they're on NoEvDia, right? Mm-hmm. So they're just probably friends with Deathspell Omega. And the press release, in fact, mentions that what they're doing is inspired somewhat by the mid-tempo aspects of Orthodox black metal. And again, that's these guys are, these guys think a lot about music. They use terms like this and know what they mean, right? So they do see themselves as somewhat aligned with that movement, which makes sense given their first one came out in '98. But it is a really different articulation of it. And I like what you said about not skronky. The Blackdeath sound produces dissonance and complex disharmony and general disorientation through extreme clarity of form. And I think that's that's a prominent, I think that's always been important to them, but that is really prominent on this record, which depends on separate, clearly recorded guitar parts. One way of getting at that blend of highbrow conception and then sort of lowbrow or visceral execution is a lot of what they're doing is you could say it's a relatively simple songwriting trick that anyone could employ, that they're using in a very deliberate way to create staggering variation and intensity. And that is they're rejecting a convention of metal writing, which is the subdivision between lead and rhythm riff. And the way that the rhythm guitar, and even more so the bass, is very often just chained to the root note of the chord progression. Or, really there's one riff, and it's kind of a rhythm guitar riff that's also the lead, and there's not an independent line.
You could almost compare the riff writing structurally to the Karn record from last year, but melodically much more hostile to the listener.
Yes, and the Karn record often has... The last half of this record sounds quite similar to the Karn record in certain ways, especially having these kind of barnstorming, ornate, Gothic cathedral riffs. But Karn are often much more focused on two guitars intertwining in a complex way to produce. There is really cool divergence in the harmony, but it's often a more conventional sense of them being complementary.
Yeah, you can hear
just complementary. What
you can hear the underlying dissection and sacramentum.
Right. Yeah, and Dawn, I think. Yes, all that. You hear it's like the Swedish style. You have these independently moving. You have these lines that are moving in, say, like rhythmic unison. So this, or wrong term. Basically, this is what I wanted to say. I had to look up some music theory terms that I sort of, you think you know and then you forget to talk about this record. Basically, like, the basic conceit of this record is, what if we just played 2 or 3 riffs at the same time? Right? They have 2 guitar lines. In fact, they have a second line courtesy of Arjan from Dianceht, who put out their music before. And they have a talented bassist who's involved in the songwriting. So this is... everyone is playing a part here.
The bassist is actually Colonel Parabellum. He's actually the main guy.
Yeah. Well, I guess his brother is credited with a lot of the songwriting too. I think this is a very collaborative band. The other guy, Abyss Looker, is his brother, and then Maya, the drummer, is, I think, also very involved in and is doing some vocals on this record. Anyway, lineup digression. Basically, you have a band where everyone shows up to play, and where there's not a lot of ego in terms of how the writing is organized and how the parts are dealt out. And once you have that idea that you can have 2 riffs at the same time, you can use that to do relatively straightforward things, or you can go wild. And Blackdeath approached this with a huge freedom of imagination and openness. So, like, a lot of this record is strictly counterpoint. That is, you have really 2 distinct melodic lines with their own rhythmic sensibilities, or 3. And often 1 or 2 of those parts are very, very simple, but they're still really doing a different thing in a way that is different from, like, a chained rhythm guitar. And they're timbrally separated from each other, right? They've got a different guitar tone in a way that sets them off, so they're not blending. You get a lot of permutations and combinations from that. And at other times, maybe you've got something more like polyphony, which is just they're working within consistent rhythm, but 2 lines moving in the same, aligned in rhythm, but with independent melodies. That's more like what Karn does. Right, with those sort of swooping lines that swoop past each other and then cross, and then and so Blackdeath do that a fair amount here too. And then the other option is bringing all the lines together, which we can talk about more as a possibility. But basically, once you embrace the idea of not just having one thing be the riff, you're able to generate this friction that kind of is that is propulsive and kind of compelling to the listener, at least to this guy. Not just in terms of, this is complex, but more so in terms of the cross rhythms and harmonies it generates. It's a very energized way of writing because you have these things playing off each other. Do you mind if I lead off with an example of this?
Yeah, I think we should get through it. This is one where it's like we're going to have to really talk about the samples in detail.
Yeah. So here basically is just 1:20 into the first track where I was like, this is cool. Here you'll hear that blend of simplicity and extreme complexity I was talking about. And in terms of what to listen for, we've got at the beginning, we've got a lead over a 1-chord staccato riff, and the bass moving pretty freely on an 8th note pulse. And you'll hear how these things diverge but also mesh. And, let's just say it doesn't sound like Satanic War Master.
Ja.
Okay, so pretty cool process of sort of stepwise escalation there. But so you can hear what happens. They establish this very firm pattern, and then about 50 seconds in, that static rhythm part that's just playing octave, like one octave chord, just one stab, rises from the root and starts doing this simple escalating riffing, the wham dum 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 wham dum 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 wham dum 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 wham dum wham dum, and it sounds almost procedurally generated, right? It's kind of a, and what it is kind of a deliberately rigid take on I use the word punk loosely here because we're talking about the heavy sort of mid-tempo aspects of music with a punk influence, but it's kind of like a punk riff. And it's kind of like something you hear on an Amoebics record, basically. And it's a riff that on its own might sound a little bit lifeless, right? And kind of rote. But instead what happens is that in this context, it is charged by the friction with all the parts around it. And as it starts rising, it takes center stage. So that spiraling lead, that which was the lead now appears as a static rhythm part, right? Kind of like as an embellishment. It becomes a texture, and the thing we're really paying attention to is these escalating stabs of octave chord. And the bass keeps moving, with some relation to what the chorded guitar is doing, but it's still kind of independent.
I think that it's sort of one of the things that we're going to get at on this record is that many cool sections of this album are made of relatively simple or even seemingly stock gestures, but this is not an album about riffs so much as arrangement and layering. And these guys have a really unique way of finding new dimension in relatively conventional figures by arranging them and layering them in a really sophisticated way. Just about everything we heard in that sample is something we've basically heard before, but these guys have a real nuance to the way they put things together. Also, listening to this, a particular comparison that I want to make, later Abigor still stands out as prominent here, but something else that I think is really important to this band that we don't talk about on this show a whole lot is probably Bethlehem.
That's not a big thing for either of us, but it's probably big here.
Not really. I'm not a huge Bethlehem fan, but I think there's a definite comparison to make between the way these guys arrange and the way Bethlehem did on albums like Dark Metal or Suicide. Something about the creeping organic quality of how these songs progress. This sort of ominously...
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, this ominously rising doom. Yeah, and Bethlehem is also a band that is not really a riff band. And, of course, also we can say that the particular vocal acrobatics of Mr. Bellum are definitely comparable to a lot of early Bethlehem work.
Yeah, man, this his insistence... I mean, one thing Blackdeath is a testament to is, the persistent interest in and respect for German intellectual culture in Russia, and which you could see all over the 19th century Russian novels and stuff. But it's still around. But of course, the voice is so funny, right? There's deliberately something a bit carnivalesque about it, and it sounds like a drunk Russian guy having a fucking blast making fun of German. There's clearly a deep respect for the language, and they're using it for the the Faustian connotations, and just because it sounds harsh and cool, and maybe it's fun to step outside the native tongue in the same way that I enjoy doing Kaldrat impersonations. But it has a theatricality that is just kind of a treat to listen to.
Yeah. Another comparison I thought of while listening to this the other day. A lot of Blackdeath reminds me of like mid-era Lucifugum. Their experimental records.
Yes.
Yeah, stuff like Vector 33 or Sociopath, those albums that I hold really near and dear to my heart. There's a lot of that in here. The sort of like weird, decaying, spacey quality. You know, that's a particular sound that I really enjoy in black metal. It's like the sort of cold, alien, spacey stuff, but not the stuff that's about space. That sucks.
Right,
you know?
Right. No, I mean, this band probably came up in parallel to Lucifugum.
Oh, definitely.
And yeah, really very simultaneous, and really they both fit that strange niche of like the other Slavic black metal.
Yeah.
Right? Right? This definitely is kind of a style or micro style in the region, and it's really not like anything else, but I could only name... It would be hard to name more than 4 or 5 bands doing something like this. From,
I think it's almost less of a style and more just like a collection of bands who feel very unmoored and unrestricted. Like Lucifugum.
Yeah.
Like Blackdeath is a band that, you know, sort of plays around in a space but orients around a particular style, whereas Lucifugum is this band that shapeshifts every 3 albums into a completely different band. I like that. You know, I like
so
that. So
they're both kind of like protean.
Yeah. I think that's really neat, and I think that maybe one of the reasons that works for both of these bands is that, like, you know, Lucifugum is the core husband and wife couple who have been doing this for so many years together, with other people assisting as needed, and then Blackdeath is the core of the 2 brothers working together with others popping in.
I also suspect that, I mean, just speculating here, I have no idea, but I suspect that Maya might be married to one of them.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility, too. And I mean, she's been with the band for a very long time now, too, 15 years.
2007, yeah.
Yeah, so very, very long-running, stable lineup for both of those bands.
Yes.
Let me get to my sample. The second track, Vegan Lied for de Toten. So these songs are really difficult to sample. There's something very horizontal about this album. As I said, it's not necessarily riff-based, and no one riff on a song tends to be the center of gravity. These tracks tend to kind of creep along, and they ebb and flow, and don't really have like peaks or valleys in the ways that you typically associate with extreme metal, but they're still really exciting and fascinating to listen to nonetheless. And what I want to point out here is something that I think is really important about the melodic character of this record. In a lot of black metal, there is a tendency to push distinctly toward the more consonant or more dissonant ends of the spectrum. You know, that's one of the things that was a casualty of the disappearance of full spectrum black metal as the genre became more and more specialized. Blackdeath, though, doesn't restrict themselves in such a way. So there's highly dissonant material, and there's also highly consonant material, but one of the defining features of the consonant material is that the melodies tend to refuse to resolve. They become these looping, sorrowful figures that just sort of hang in the air and repeat, but not in the manner of sort of like listless post-black noodling. There's something more substantial going on, and I think this track is a really great example of that.
Swine!
So the primary sort of looping melodic fragment there is probably one of the most conventionally Slavic black metal melodies that you'll hear on this record. But the way they play with it, dropping it an octave and then spinning it off into its own sort of pseudo lead, all the while the bass is playing like a different counterpoint every single time it loops. The way these guys arrange stuff and the way these guys write songs is so fascinating. It's got a nearly jam room quality to it, but it's so meticulously detailed that it can't merely be a result of constant jamming. There's a distinct planning, a distinct organizational principle at work underneath the surface. But I remember when I heard this, listening to that really pretty Slavic line and listening to the repeated permutation of that melody, constantly waiting for it to arrive at the big riff, capital B, capital R, and it never happens. The rest of this song is just playing with the contours of that line, never really arriving at a satisfying conclusion. And that tends to happen a lot across the course of this record, which makes it this fascinating combination of sort of like relaxed and pastoral and very, very tense and claustrophobic at the same time.
These are in a sense very folky melodies, but they do not do the things that you would expect those to do.
Yes, it very, very strange. Like, the mood on this record is nearly indescribable.
Sort of like pedantic point, but like I think sort of worth pointing out is like what you said about the riffs is like you were like basically it can be very consonant, but they don't really resolve. I think that's key. Technically, I guess that line that you highlighted there does resolve, right? Da 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 da. But it just goes back to the root and starts again. It doesn't release the tension. And what there never is the cathartic end of phrase turnaround.
No.
You're never going to hear like a big interval slashing heavy metal chord. You're never going to go like da 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 da.
Or he's
nothing like that.
Or they're not going to swoop down, past the root a full step in the French style or something. They stay away from the natural impulses toward melodrama that are a part of this style.
Yes, there's.
It's so weird. Sorry. It's so weird. No, that's all I have.
Well, the lack of melodrama is right. Even though it's very dramatic music because it depends on these constant. You're watching these processes unfold in a way that's a lot closer to like jazz or something. You're like, shit, what are they going to do next? But like. It has that sense of escalation, but it's not. Yes, it doesn't have the melodrama. It doesn't have all the big releases and the expressive gestures that we explain or expect. There's something. Even though this record is almost never stereotypically aggressive, there's something very aggressive in the way they keep these phrases sort of coiled and looping.
I think that it has to do with the preoccupation, not just in terms of like how these guys execute lyrics, but musically also on like the German style. The sort of like terse stoicism of it all. Note that like a lot of the bands that we're mentioning as reference points that are not Slavic are German or, in Adipocere's case, Austrian.
That's a good point. Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, I mean, I think you did a good job of really highlighting the sort of the independent movement of the parts. Basically, over the course of the song, those parts tend to diverge more and more. My sort of, in the fashion of this album, here's a simple sort of big take, right? The record basically works as a whole. I mean, really, it's not me who's coming up with that take, it's them. Mm-hmm. Basically, like, they take the simple conceit they have that's animating these songs. What if two riffs at once? becomes a simple but powerful conceit for organizing the entire record in a very dramatic way. So you've got this songwriting method based on generating tension via diverging melodic lines. And what could you do over the course of a record with that tension? Well, the dunce in the back of the class says, what if you, brought those lines together and resolved the tension? And there's a very obvious move, which is just not doing that, right? There's an almost as obvious, right? The sort of the middle of the bell curve move is, what if we just sort of didn't? But in a way, Blackdeath kind of just go for it, I think. That does not negate the death metal guy's point that a kind of unresolved tension is essential here. The melodies don't really change, per se, right? We're not going to get a harmonic resolution. We're not going to get a glorious Aeolian scale melody or an ode to joy. But there's a sense of a very fractured melodic and rhythmic structure at the beginning that gets gathered together, and it's because the parts shift on the scale from counterpoint towards monophony, literally being the same melodic line set apart at a stable interval, like an octave or a fifth, right? One of those big intervals that makes it almost the same melody, just moving in parallel. And they do so. They produce a kind of convergence and resolution, even as the melodies maintain that insistent, obsessive tension. So here's where that process starts to happen, or they first signal that this is what's going on in a very direct, maybe the most clear way on the record. This is on the fourth track, Emilia, and you will, I think, hear what I mean very quickly.
I imagine that's probably a pretty dramatic reinterpretation of the original.
What's the original?
It's a Dead Can Dance song.
Really?
Yeah, that's.
Where does it say that in the notes?
No, on Metal Archives. Emilia, Dead Can March, Dead Can Dance cover.
Far out. That is so cool. That must be on one of the later records. I do not know that one by name.
Huh. That's interesting.
But yes, the Dead Can Dance reference points are, the cover has a very DCD vibe. Maybe we'll see if we can come back to that at the end. But yeah, that's got to be a pretty dramatic reimagination. And as they've done it, it has it still has the kind of nasty, restless melody that the death metal guy pointed out. But it is a very concerted melody that's strictly monophonic. All those lines are moving in exact parallel together. The independent parts have shifted decisively together. And from this point on, that becomes another piece of their toolkit. It's when do we... how do we start bringing these parts together more and more as the record goes on?
Mm-hmm. So I've got another one from Verwunschung a little bit later, just from the very beginning of this track. This is something that's probably more obvious than a lot of the stuff that we've already covered, but I think it bears mentioning, which is that Blackdeath is a band that, to me, kind of fulfills the promise of Orthodox black metal as a continuation or extension of black metal. And it does it by getting rid of a lot of the sort of holdover stuff in Orthodox black metal that still really wants to be cool, Now, don't get me wrong, this is a very cool record, but, this has the challenging and interesting parts of a band like Aosoth, but it doesn't have the spooky arpeggio. It doesn't have the really hyper-speed blast stuff that you'll see in a lot of Orthodox black metal. This is very committed to the kind of challenging mid-pace stuff.
And it doesn't have the kind of crowd-pleasing pop moments that are also kind of integral to the style, right? Like, I mean, I do think this song is great. I do think Casas Luciferi is a pretty damn good hallmark for the style. But, like, I Am the Earth by Watain is, like, you know, there's some, like, difficult harmony on that, but that has just a big, grandiose moment that's clearly written for stadiums. And there's nothing like that here. And you could even say Death Spell Omega kind of secretly has those things in terms of like, oh, it's the Sola Fide riff.
Yeah, I was about to say. I mean, it's they have those riffs because, you know, they're still committed to secretly being a French black metal band.
Right. They make you work for it, but they're there. So, yes, and there's there is none of that conventional sense of heavy metal coolness here. This is a band that's really, they're cool by not worrying about being cool.
Yeah. Blackdeath seems a little bit more interested in, like, the proto-Orthodox stuff that I've suggested is like the sort of underpinning of Orthodox black metal, which is like Grand Declaration of War and the Thorns record.
Yeah.
It's not as like aggressively spiky as either of those things, but I think that this track in particular really resembles those a lot. Man, if Orthodox black metal could have sounded like that instead, I would have liked it so much more.
Yeah, well, it's really about sounding like that in a sort of focused a way as this band does. Because we were talking. I mean, in some ways, that riff wouldn't be out of place on any of the records we mentioned, but it's so well executed, and what they do to it is, yeah.
Yeah, and I like the part of the promise of, like I said, part of the promise of Orthodox black metal was this is the next thing. You know, Orthodox black metal really sort of positioned itself as like what the center of black metal would be going forward.
Yes.
That ended up not actually being true. It looked like it was going to be true for a few years there, but then it sort of didn't. You know, it ended up petering out and becoming a substyle dominated by Icelandic triangle bands. But this has a lot more in common with, again, like Grand Declaration of War, and part of that involves giving up on some of the established structural forms. Like that, the big riff here with that massive whole band stop mid-riff. Mm-hmm. That's the sort of thing you would hear on Grand Declaration, and that's the sort of thing that, violates specific tenets of the second wave for good reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, specifically like the stop. Mm-hmm. And the way they force you to, so that riff really actually is that is the record's maybe only big slashing wide interval power chord riff where you have something like an epic heavy metal riff, and they make you stop and then carry the melody over the stop to get the resolution. So it's delivered in a very dramatic way, and it's kind of a punchy hook riff, but it's really, there's an austerity underpinning it, and there's also a lot of change in the riff as it crosses those gaps again and again.
Yeah, it's a really sophisticated technique. It's super distinctive. It gives you big heavy metal kicks, but delivered in a completely different way than you're used to. This record as a whole really is like, talk about like super down the line black metal that you would only fully appreciate after just like a shit ton of years of listening to this kind of music. And it's like, it's exciting every time we find something like this in the wild.
Yeah, man. I mean, in a way, I've really got to like sort of eat my hat about the not big dramatic moments thing that I said before this sample, because like basically we just heard one of the record's biggest, most dramatic moments, and there were all sorts of places that had that kind of powerful, decisive hook thing I was talking about, and is specifically even maybe more so in Watain than DSO. It had sort of there was a theatrical grandeur and a spaciousness to this that's a little bit different from the horror vacui thing on, C Monumentum. But but again, it really does have some of these big moments, but it's executed with a totally different kind of rigor and openness, and without the without certain of the deliberately refusing some of the spooky satanic flavor of black metal, mm-hmm. which might be part of where the Dead Can Dance references are coming in. Man, I mean, this is basically a record that, like, for you to say anything about it, you will immediately find yourself contradicting or qualifying that statement, like 30 seconds later.
Well, it does so much over the course of its runtime. Yeah. It's very, very broad, very full spectrum, but like focused around like a really solid stylistic core.
Yeah. It's just hilarious that I said something about it, and it then turned out this example like directly disproved it. It was the best. I forgot how this track went. I forgot that this one was the one with the big stops, and I forgot that the big stops sounded like that epic. And so like it was just. It was just you picked the minute and a half on this record that could not have more directly undermined what I said before.
Well, to be fair, even in this instance, the big epic moment is so different in character from that description used for basically any other black metal record,
Yes, it's one that only shows up if you're sort of primed to listen for it and you have a certain kind of patience. Honestly, I mean, when I was younger, I hated anything that had kind of a stop-start feel, and it's taken doing this show to open my ears to some of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, so in terms of just the overall pattern I'm pointing to, we've got final track has it basically moves towards, we get closer and closer to after that track the death metal guy sampled Verwunschen, we get closer and closer to more down the line riffy black metal on the last two tracks, and especially on the second to last track. This is Im Namen des Kunstlichen Intellekts, and I like the riff. And we are back with our second record of the night, also from Russia. Also a pretty well-established band with its own cult following, although I think a band that has been a little bit forgotten over their years, especially given their last decade of silence. This is the new one from Old Wainds. It's called Stormheart, and it's out on Darkness Shall Rise Productions. So, what is a Waind? Often I want to look these things up. I don't want to know. A Waind is many things. What I know is that it's nothing I've heard of, and it sounds fucking hard. It's a wound, it's a wand,
it's a wind,
it's a wagon, it's wind. Yes, it's a good multi-resonant word that could, for all I know, be Old English, but could be completely made up by Russians. So this is one of those bands that, like, for guys our age, was a cool guy named Czech on the internet, right? It was something that, it was a sort of cult band that for many people was a favorite band, but a lot of people would just never have heard it. They were recommended to me when I was younger. I never checked them out enough. I heard parts of their records that I thought were really, really cool. And it was that kind of thing that was a little off my radar where I was like, damn, this is good. I need to buy this. And then, of course, I was too lazy and poor to buy it. So, you just kind of forget about it. But it was mentioned to me for a couple reasons. Basically, believe it or not, there was a time when I was not completely obsessed with Slavonic black metal. I liked, Graveland Thousand Swords, and I liked Hate Forest, but I wasn't that stoked on a lot of the rest of it, on your Druid or your Blazebirth Hall. And so I wanted stuff that had a little bit more of the Scandinavian punch and more kind of overt, in-your-face aggression and heaviness. Maybe stuff that sounded almost punkier, right? The classic Slavic style is interesting because it gets very far away from both heavy metal and punk. And it's Old Wainds has more to do with both of them. In particular, they have more sort of like bold, clearly defined power chord riffs. But that's only something I really remember. Until I listened to this record, I didn't even quite remember that. But basically, they were recommended to me as something that was a little closer to the Scandinavians. The other reason is I heard them, at least by one of my friends, mentioned, and maybe also by you, mentioned alongside Spite Extreme Wing as bands from the 2000s that took music that worked in kind of austere and cold ways and actually made it a lot more warm and in your face in terms of the guitar tone and the fiery punkish delivery. And that's might seem a little odd with Old Wainds because the music is so imagistic. These guys are from Murmansk, so that's very far north Russia, that's close to Finland. And the music is very focused on sort of the elemental turbulence, vortices of frost and spires of glacial bone in a way that is, kind of related to Blazebirth Hall. But despite the relentless focus on a winter, the guitar tone is a lot more beefy and warm. It's like a hot tone, highly distorted and heavy, in a way that makes it quite different from comparable Slavic bands playing this sort of thing. Which is something I could get into in a minute, what it's like and not like. So I must confess, I did not have time to go back and study the old records before we did this one. I wasn't blown away by this record when I first clicked through it, and I know that you had kind of a critical take on it, which I think there's something to. However, on listening to it more, I like it a lot, and I do think it stands out in the way that people said it stood out back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you definitely didn't hear the comparison despite Extreme Wing from me, because I have never heard an old Wainds song before covering this record. Like you, they're a name that was bandied around a lot, as I was first discovering Slavic black metal in like the mid to late 2000s. But I just never got around to checking them out. Probably because they were always just like... Old Wainds were kind of just mentioned like in the middle of a batch of bands to check out. I didn't really ever have anyone evangelizing for them in particular. And I think that if you're the kind of person who gets into Slavic black metal, you end up checking out like 80% of those names, and then the other 20%, like, you just never get around to until you start a metal podcast 15 years after you discover all the others. So... As just like threadbare prep, I was driving around the other day, and I threw on an old Wainds record just to see what it was like. So I just opened up Spotify, and I landed on their 2008 record, and I listened to a few tracks from that, and it was pretty neat. It was very much in the vein of later Dub Buck, in the sense that it is Slavic black metal filtered through a prism of like very distinct like martial thrash metal. It was really cool.
That's why it was recommended to me.
Yeah.
That's the Spite Extreme Wing parallel too.
That makes sense. From what I've gathered, it seems like that's kind of a departure for their discography, that record in particular. And I thought it was neat, but it's like, okay, so categorically this is basically like simplified Ruspanad Vise by Dubbuck. But, that's neat. I've got time for that because that's a very specific style you don't see a lot of. So I got over to Stormheart, the new one, and that is not what is on display here. Not at all. So I don't actively dislike this record, but I guess the big debate that we're going to have is you making the argument for this having kind of a unique position, and me making the argument that this just generally feels very stock to me. Stormheart largely feels built out of parts or kinds of riffs that I have been listening to in this sort of regional style of black metal for like basically as long as I've been listening to it. As a result, it resembles a lot of things. It resembles BBH in fits and starts. It's got a little bit of almost like late Immortal quality to it here and there, this like fast streaming kind of epic thing. So, that's a little bit of a wrinkle. But in general, it just sort of like largely reminds me of just an idea of traditional Slavic black metal, which is a style that I really love, but I'm just not convinced that anything that happens on this record is either one, distinct enough, or two, really just like executed well enough for me to listen to it rather than any number of these other records that I'm really familiar with. I don't really take any joy in saying this because this isn't like a bad record or an undeserving record that I'm like having fun lambasting. It's just kind of ho-hum to me. It's got some cool moments. I think that from what I can tell on this record, I think that Old Wainds works better in contexts where they're a little bit more rhythmically dynamic. I think that the stompier kind of mid-pace stuff on this record tends to be better than a lot of the like streaming, droning blast sections in the BBH vein, which sort of makes...
I could agree with that.
It sort of makes sense why the thrashier third album would appeal to me more. I think that's just where the skills lie for these guys, but given that this is a traditional Slavic black metal record, it dedicates a lot of minutes to its runtime to single foot blast beats and decent-ish trem riffs. And I just...
streaming chorded tremolo melodies with sort of tense but noble harmonization.
Exactly. And when that is your style, it may be unfair, but you are going to, in my mind, go head to head against Forest, and you're pretty much going to lose every time in that competition. But I am open to hearing arguments that this is more distinct than I gave it credit.
Okay, now that's a fair take, and I mean, I think like based on what you said about your, reviewing this band, it does sound like this record is maybe less unique than their old stuff, and certainly less unique than the record you described, right? This is what we've got here is much less sort of muscular, thrashing Slavonic folk metal, and much more, much closer to what we would call on the show just a down-the-line Slav black album. But I do think that you still hear the core of this band's personality in their take on that style. I think the band that made the thrashing record is still here and does set it apart from comparable stuff. But in order to address that, we really do, and in order to make important concessions to your argument, we really got to say what this sounds like. I mean, maybe what we can say is Old Wainds sounds much more Ukrainian than the other Russian bands.
I think that's fair.
Maybe they sounded more like Dubbuk at first, and now they sound a lot like Astrophase. So we're going to listen to just the first 17 seconds of the second track on Stormheart, Northern Starfall. So death metal guy, I can see how when you heard a riff like that on this record, you're just like, oh, okay, it's more of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I basically like it because I like that style, but,
Right, yeah. Well, here is what it sounds like. This is the first 17 seconds of Astrophase's song, Forgotten Name, from Heritage.
They're the same picture.
Yeah, glad you heard that.
Yeah, because it's the same riff. Of course I heard it.
Yeah. And you could do that with a bunch of different Astrophase riffs and a bunch of riffs on this record. You could take Astrophase's song Hate Fang, which starts with a more sort of grinding Norwegian riff, and between that and the more epic riffs, I think I'm either talking about Hate Fang or Blackest Mountain Chain of Cursed Time. But there are just certain songs on Astrophase records that would give you half of the musical DNA for this record, which is fascinating because the Astrophase songs have 2 to 3 riffs per song.
Astrophase rules. I mean, I love that band.
I'm glad you like them. Yeah, that's we should do a little explainer on that for the people. Basically, you've heard them mentioned in lists of bands, doubtless, but this is the third of the great Kharkov bands. This was Thurios's band, and then Sanko joined it, and they recorded the classic Astrophase records basically while they were writing all the Hate Forest stuff, and then the early Druid records. And what Astrophase sounds like, the chronology is complicated, but it sounds like the common root of Hate Forest and Druid, with a much more compact approach to melody. So it's very folky, and it has kinds of bright and complex harmonies that you get in Druid, but delivered as just like 3-chord, furiously fast and aggressive power chord melodies.
Alternately, it's like it's like retarded tough guy BBH. Yeah, it's probably influenced by Blazebirth Hall, right? Those are the people who were... Yeah, that happened a little bit before Kharkov. And yes, it has my buddy said that I think it helped me really appreciate Astrophase. He was like, I love its retarded Sodom energy. Yeah.
you can tell that Astrophase it's very in touch with the gut level instinctive aspect of this music. And though it is relative to a lot of metal and even black metal, it is austere and monolithic. It's also very immediate and ripping, and it is not invested in any kind of sophistication. It's and you can also hear just a lot of undigested Graveland in it. It's just Graveland really fast. And there's also majestic mid-tempo stuff, but again, it's much more. Astrophase also sounds consistently very martial, and which, as opposed to Druid's much wider range of vibes, sort of mournful pastoralism, and Astrophase is it's very solar, right? Hate Forest is very aggressive and storming, but it's nocturnal. Astrophase is just bright and bold, and it's a Cossack walking up to a guy and punching him in the face, right, just for fun.
Astrophase really is sort of like the real black metal band, in contrast to so much of the Ukrainian and Russian sort of like accidentally extremely arty quality.
Yes, well, I think it was a kind of intentional, but yes, Hate Forest and Droog are very high concept, and the Blazebirth Hall bands are very high concept, and all of them get away from conventional notions of metal. Astrophase does not. It's just really loud, and it hits you over the head like a ton of bricks. So in that sense, it obviously has a kindred spirit with Old Wainds, which is much more in your face than some other bands it might sound like. And you hear that spirit all over this album. So the question is just, okay, where is the added value? And I'll try to get to that with some of the reviews, but basically I would say it is, what's the difference? Well, it's everything that makes Astrophase different from the other Kharkov bands. Old Wainds does even more in a way that makes it different from Astrophase, right? This record has some parts that are folky, but it's much less folky. It doesn't really sound like Graveland. It is much less monolithic and deliberately rigid. It is less austere, and it has often more conclusive conventional resolutions to phrases. And it is also just a lot like Astrophase is. It's visceral and manly, but it's not, and it's more fun than Hate Forest, but it's not exactly fun music.
No,
this is what.
This is Astrophase subtracted of Astrophase's underlying Ildjarn.
Yes. So it's subtracted of the Ildjarn and all the things about Slavic black metal straining against heavy metal. This is these have kind of, relatively speaking at least, Old Wainds has kind of action-packed, eventful song structures. It has a certain rhythmic dynamism, and it has groove, as you said. And it has these, even more so than Astrophase, it has these big, simple, heavy metal melodies bashed out on power chords in a way that gives you the oomph of, like, just, the Crazy Train riff, or, that one, that one riff on the Ultima Thule record that you love. So yeah, that's my take on this. But why don't you get to a sample?
Okay, so I'm going to go to the back half of the little micro sample you played up front, the back half of Northern Starfall. I like this part a lot. The back half of this track is probably my favorite part of the album. And I think it's like, I do not think Old Wainds are great at writing sort of BBH style riffs, largely. They're a little bit too interested in heavy metal, hence the late Immortal comparisons. They just don't have that intuitive grasp of, like, wildly organic yet deeply inhuman melody that those bands had. But what they can do is take some of that BBH energy and combine it with like some more like Central European RAC stomp vibes and come out with something that's pretty fun. So the back half of this track is dominated by a really cool kind of like Slavic groove black riff that I think is actually like kind of unique. You can hear the shoutrug peeking through just a little bit on this stuff in a way that's actually compelling. So let's listen to this, and I also like the way that they juice it by playing around with reorienting the riff around different drum beats, and just overall I think it's really effective, and I wish more of the record sounded like this. Okay, so the band does something kind of smart and self-conscious here. You know, the BBH methodology is to find the ultimate version of all those riffs and play it 600 times into a cassette answering machine, which rules. I think that old Wainds realized that they don't have access to that ultimate riff because you had to be an insane person to get there, and these are like more regular people. But what they can do is make like 4 pretty good versions of that riff and sequence them in a pretty cool way where the aggregate is more than the sum of its parts. I think that whole sequence of all those variations of that same basic chording idea are really strong, and it's like it's one of the smartest and most elegant moments of the record. The problem is, like, that doesn't happen enough. There's a lot more of this record is defined by a kind of an overcommitment to riffs that I just don't think are worth overcommitting to. But I think that this manner of sort of, you know, playing with the contours of, you know, little micro variations and stuff, like, if all the record sounded like this, it might be like a year-ender for me.
I see what you mean about the BBH thing riff. I mean, I just enjoy listening to those kind of riffs, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's me as a genre fan, right?
Yeah, I get that.
The sort of pared back version of them here, I'm okay with, and I kind of like hearing them with this sort of buzzing, with this sort of big in your face guitar tone. But it's really true that this song, for the most part, does not have a lot of independent character. And it's only when you get to like the last minute and they pull out these riffs that are ironically much simpler, that you really hear the band's personality. And I agree with you. I wish there was a whole song that sounded like that. I mean, it has a... I can see the Sargeist thing, and I can see how even the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da connects to some of the really sort of early, bold Forest riffs. Like Forest, you always told me I'd love Forest's first album, and it's true, right? There's a couple huge riffs like that. But it also just sounds like a more aggressive and just tighter, better version of a lot of modern stompy RAC black metal.
Or it's like
they just do,
it's like stuff that's like from that era running, contemporary to it, like, Runes of Dianceht.
Runes of Dianceht is, I thought, older, but I'm glad you mentioned them. Also Ukrainian.
Running parallel to BBH initial Slavonic black metal startup. That's what I meant.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so Runes of Dianceht mentioned. We have mentioned them. Really sick band. And basically also from Kharkov, and they're sort of like the black sheep of the Kharkov crew because it is very aggressive street-level skinhead music. But it's also, and the song structures have much more stomp and punkishness to them. And yeah, those kinds of like riffs like that. However, they also have a kind of like crumbling, remote, incoherent black metal quality to them, and a really drunk quality to them. That's a little bit different. So yeah, I guess cleaned up and slightly sobered Runes of Dianceht would be a good comparison for this. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's see. So yeah, basically we sort of agree about that spot. I think this record has the unfortunate thing of we talk about this periodically, right? A record has a weak first two tracks, and for one of us it will really kind of jaundice us about the rest of the record. And I think that's kind of fair. The first two tracks are pretty decisive. Everyone expects the first track to be a bit of a warm-up, but if you don't hit the big one by number two, So, I'm going to play number 3, which I think is awesome and showcases the kind of more eventful and dynamic songwriting that these guys bring to the table relative to something like Astrophase. Yeah, so that riff is very cool. You can hear how that very powerful trem riff sounds kind of like Astrophase, but it's got a lot more detail in it, and it's got kind of a cool hybrid quality where it starts out with this sort of the more sort of textured folky chording you expect from the Slav bands, and then just dives into fixed power chords. It sort of consolidates, and there's a great A-B variation. At first it holds on the seventh of the minor scale, like the flat seven, like a whole step below the root, dum dum, and then on the second variation it just does a classic thing and dives down from the 7 to the 6, right, dum dum. It's very cool, but like the real core of the action there is everything they do as the around to set that up, right? The riff that we start with sounds much more kind of generically Slavic, and then we end up in this arpeggiated folk section, but it doesn't sound that folky. It sounds quite modern. There's a very cool, it sounds kind of like Fields of the Nephilim, gothy arpeggios, or any kind of modern black metal bands that do a lot of stuff like that, in part because of the sound, the more distorted buzzing sound. It has less of that clean Astrophase. If they played a riff like that, would give it this kind of like watery clean guitar folk effect. And they do like this really cool strut change up where they completely redirect the momentum in the arpeggio riff and then just go back to the main one. And then they launch into this sort of much more dissonant, sharp minor blast section that sounds kind of Norse, that I think actually accelerates. It gets very fast. There's a cool escalation there. And then we're in a different arpeggio section, and the melody is completely different. And instead of this kind of doop-dot, two-step strut thing, we're in much more of a tension-releasing, head-banging downbeat thing. That's the best way of distilling what I want to say. Old Wainds is the only major Slavonic black metal band that you can headbang to.
Black metal guy... Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, finish up.
No. I was just going to say, like, you can get crazy to Astrophase, but you can't really headbang to it.
Well, I mean, I can very carefully, but... Okay, so Black Metal Guy, what we were actually arriving at is one of those subtle but, like, razor-sharp distinct differences in riffing preference between you and I that we only run into once or twice a year. No, I mean, that's the funny thing is, we always talk about it's like, I'm not really the death metal guy, you're not really the black metal guy. These are just like terms of art that are fun because we really agree on like 90% of everything. But over the years, I've started to realize these like tiny particularisms. There is a kind of swaying pagan black riffing that you really love that I have like no interest in. And it is, and I think that this now I can like technically articulate it. Old Wainds riffs across this record are usually based on pivots between two large chords as like the foundation of a riff. Old Wainds, you've got the low chord, you'll add some embellishments on the upper strings, and then they'll sweep up 2 steps and then do a different embellishment up there, and then sweep back down. It's basically a pivot between an A chord and a B chord. I am not into that at all. I barely consider it a riff. It barely even counts to me. To me, that is just like almost purely textural in nature because it lacks enough melodic information to really do something. And this comes back to like my like intense preference for like very narrative melodic structures. that we've talked about.
This is where the death metal guy thing comes to the fore, right?
Yeah,
this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of that distinction. You like through composition and maybe not elaborate riffing, but like a clearly defined riff, even if it's sort of dissonant and gnarly.
And a clearly defined sort of like sequence and progression. Whereas
that's a better way of putting it. Yes.
This has more to do with a kind of punk riffing. There's like the discharge lurks within the bowels of these riffs. Which I get and respect and understand as a technical skill, but I have never enjoyed myself.
I get it. And once you point out the trick to it, I do understand. There's a kind of... So you're saying that's true of the trem riffs and even of the sort of broken arpeggio riffs here?
I think it's like largely true of most of the riffs on the album. They're oriented around pivoting between two large chords.
It turns out I like songs composed of only two chords. What will I do?
No, I totally get it.
No. I mean, I'm joking. It's like, well, now that you put it that way, it does make a lot of sense.
But it also,
and it is. Yeah, go on.
Well, it also fits with my preferences for black metal as like ornate melodic music, whereas you can listen to it as like heavy textural music in a way that I don't, because I go to death metal for that, as we've established. So I think that's the main thing. The other thing is that the arpeggiated stuff is just of inherently limited interest to me. I think that these kinds of arpeggiated riffs in black metal are almost like 9 times out of 10 sort of holding patterns, and sometimes they're a cool holding pattern or a necessary evil for like transitioning between ideas, but like I don't get much out of them in and of themselves. But like ultimately all of these are just like straight up differences in taste, and I think I understand better listening to this now why certain people would be really drawn to this. It's just not my wheelhouse at all.
Okay, that's good. That's about the best I can hope for. Yeah, it totally makes sense that now that you say it. And yes, I am a big fan of the basically 2-chord riff. If there's the criterion for me is basically like if there's some sort of interesting harmonic trick being used or like a cool it's the individual spin they're putting on it and the kind of micro variations in harmony or texture that come in, and the way they're playing it. Right there, I think it would be fair to say Old Wainds generally have a knack for rhythm in the way they deliver certain things, whereas like in most Slavic black metal bands, especially the ones operating at faster tempos, hateful like rhythm is almost just like set to static deliberately.
Yeah, they're completely formless.
Yeah. Even and like Graveland is very rhythmically driven. The Gravelandy parts of Druk and Astrophase are, pretty rhythmically driven, but yeah, generally speaking, the blasting stuff especially is just very rigid.
And there's no better way to delineate the difference in our taste than us both sampling from the same song and you enjoying specifically the parts that I dislike. So we're going to go to the second to last track, To the Moonlight. I am starting with the first couple minutes of this track, and then the black metal guy is picking up right where I leave off. So for me, this song opens in a really cool way with a really sharp kind of Spite Extreme Wing style riff figure, just like lightning bolt geometric intensity. It's fucking awesome. But then it just descends into what I am referring to as a Slav slog. And all of them kind of sound like I can't remember the particular riff here, but like in essence they're all like that across any of these bands. And then it gets gussied up with an arpeggio figure that I find pretty immaterial. But let's get through the first couple minutes and then see what the black metal guy hears in exactly the same content. So, yeah, a sequence of awesome, very distinct, very narrative riff figures in the first minute and a half, and then we're into, like, Bad Dark Throne. It's just, like, that just doesn't do anything for me, and I already know before you say it, you love the part where he screams really loud and there's a big pick scrape.
I do like the pick scrape. I do like, you think that the guitars are playing the riff, but it was only one of the guitars, and then the other goes.
This is a place where, like, you don't see it often, but, like, your punk priors make this completely different for you.
Yeah. So that initial sequence of riffs is amazing, and even better than I remembered. The Spite Extreme in comparison is spot on, especially at the end where they hold they just do the root minor 6 octave thing and just hold it. And then, of course, that turns out to be a kind of a turnaround or a phrase closer. And then they answer it in just the most ignorant way possible. I understand why that might not fit your standards of a narrative continuity.
Well, for me, it destroys the momentum of the song.
I get it. You know, there's probably a neater way to transfer that momentum. I understand why it's unsatisfying to you. But you know what they say, one man's Slav slog is another man's metalcore beatdown. See, don't worry, we're back at the cool riff.
But by the time we get back to the cool riff, I'm already mentally checked out, man.
I do agree that the way they wrote this song is by writing one stream of extremely powerful flowing trem riffs and then deciding they needed another part and just throwing that in. However, I love it. So what was really cool to me there is that they sort of like, they introduce a more sort of textured epic version on the da ba da ba 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 riff with the, you know, the kind of like sentimental sort of arpeggio at the end, kind of jerky. And then they just commit fully to the most ignorant undertone of what they're doing. And they start zeroing in on the tone of the root note, playing it as an open string. That's one thing that happens throughout this record. And one thing it has in common with the Blackdeath is a certain jam room mentality to it. And, you know, they take that in different directions. But there's very live playing here. And they have this amazing beefy guitar tone. And they find a lot of play in that. And what they're doing with the root string here is a kind of like artificial bending, the sort of bending that almost changes the note that you get in really ignorant moments of beat down metalcore, or even in kind of gent stuff, the moments that are tolerable in that. Like it's almost a Meshuggah thing. It's just super nasty. I really like it. And, you know, you could argue that there's not a lot of momentum when it changes over to that more emotive riff, but they go back to it, they go back to the brutal riff, and then we're back into the blasting, and I'm perfectly happy. However, I do think that, and I think that's actually exemplifies, yes, you're certainly right about the punk priors thing. I'm just like, yeah! But more than that, you know, like it exemplifies the fact that this is Slav Black you can headbang to. But you did touch on something important there, which is another thing that sets Old Wainds apart from the other Slavic bands is a much more overt influence from Darkthrone. Now, Transylvanian Hunger is obviously pretty important to the Blazebirth Hall sound, and if you listen to the first the Rundagore full length, you can hear a really sort of, I must say, kind of a shameful rewrite of Transylvanian Hunger. It's literally the same song. But like, mostly that drops out of everything after that, or it becomes invisible as an influence. Here it's very visible, and I think at its best, you know, the Stormheart hews pretty close to Funeral Moon. Like, it has these kind of exuberant, ripping song structures that will like throw you from a you know, something that feels very fast into kind of a mid-tempo headbang riff. But I think at its worst, many of the parts you do hate. I think many of the parts on this record I really like this part on To the Moonlight, but there's a lot of parts on this record that are kind of like that part that I don't like. I think this is by far the best done of those lumbering mid-tempo things, because it really digs in and commits to the headbang feeling. But often this sounds like Darkthrone's lamest kind of later kind of slow grooves, or like, you know, as we say, like, oh gosh, it's the Shadow of the Horns riff again. And other parts sound too much like Transylvanian Hunger. In the Heart of the Storm, there's some cool aspects on that song, but there's some cool bespoke stuff there, but it's very Transylvanian Hunger. And the Eternal, the song title is very long. The Eternal, the Dead, the Arcane, literally has something like the Natasha riff, like kind of undigested, which is wild. So this is not an all killer, no filler record. It has, I think, like the Darkthrone thing sets them apart, but it's also the Achilles heel in a lot of ways. But what can I say? I like the drive, I like the immediacy, and if there's anything we've learned from this review, it's that I'm retarded.